but we do want you to look at that and
My name is Randy Mayu, and we have done this for over a dozen years. And we have taken one book a month, and we deal with issues of social justice and poverty and racism, and we do a deep dive into all of these books. And Gerald Britt and I and Larry James talk about how to choose the books for the year. And we've got them all chosen all the way through December. It actually says at the bottom of the schedule, this can change, but I don't think we've ever actually changed it. So we always stick with it. And I feel like I've gotten an education. And I know about a man who is not able to come, but he gets the emails and he reads each book on his own, in full, and he says it has expanded his thinking. So I'm a fan of reading books. I like TED Talks, I like articles, but reading a book is a deeper dive than that. So how do I introduce this book? And for those of you who are here for the first time, and there are quite a few of you, we'll finish at about 1:20, give or take. I speak, and then we've got a guest, David Gruber, who's going to come and lead a discussion and have some follow-up comments. And he has much more personal insight into much of this than I do. So, there are 2 or 3 ways to introduce this. Number one, raise your hand if you read this back in college and you've forgotten it. Okay? I read it in my master's program at Pepperdine University decades ago. And my interest in it was rekindled when I was reading a book by Tim Ferriss. He's the 4-Hour Workweek guy, and he's got a podcast that has had 100 million downloads. And he asks his guests, what's the most influential book you've read? And multiple guests named Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And so I hadn't read it in decades. I was reading through the Tim Ferriss book, and I said, I think I'll tackle this again. And so it was different tackling it as an adult. And, you know, I was an adult in my master's program, but barely and not much of one. So anyway, I did that. And then there are people who ask, you know, what's the most important book you've ever read? And my answer is always exactly the same: The Illustrated History of Professional Wrestling. But then after saying that, I say it's a real close contest between The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which I have also presented in this room in an earlier year, and this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And so, I feel like I'm on sacred ground presenting this book. I mean, every book we do in here is substantive and significant, but this is especially sacred. And if you don't know the bare bones story, Viktor Frankl went into 4 different death camps, including the most famous of all, Auschwitz. And he went in with his wife, who did not survive, and other family members who did not survive. And he went in, and I'm getting ahead of the story a little, with a manuscript on logotherapy, a new approach to therapy. It's considered kind of the 3rd most important arm of therapy that came out of all of those decades. And he came in with that manuscript, and it was his life's work. And of course, the Nazis took everything away. And so one of the things he said was, I had to survive the camps in order to recreate my manuscript. And so that was literally one of the things that kept him going. I always think back to a scene in the movie Chariots of Fire when I think about anything related to the Holocaust. If you remember that movie, there's a man named Abrams who won the 100-meter dash in the Olympics many decades ago. And he was out on a date with an opera star, beautiful woman, and he says, I have to win when I race. And she said, surely that wouldn't matter. Why do you have to win? He says, because I'm Jewish. And she said, surely that couldn't matter. And he said, you've never been Jewish. And I've never forgotten that letter. And when I do all of the books that I do here, I mean, I am a white male. This is not a good month or year to be a white male. But I am a white male, and I do not know what it's like to be black. I do not know what it's like to be Muslim. I do not know what it's like to be Jewish. I do not know what it's like to be female. I had a little incident early this morning that reminded me of the white male privilege. Somebody was very referential, gave deference to me in a setting that I know they wouldn't give to somebody else. And so I feel utterly incapable of doing justice to this book. I did reread every word of it when I prepared the handout, and we've got a lot to talk about. I think I want to start with a few of the key quotes. So turn to page 2, and I did present this for my company First Friday Book Synopsis at a lunch meeting a while back, and that's why it's in this format. And so here we go. Why is this book worth our time? Number one, this book has stood the test of time as a 20th century classic. In other words, it's one of those books we should have all read by now. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me in the last month, knowing that I was going to present it, oh, I've been intending to read that book, and I never have. Number two, this book deals with two great human questions, issues, and challenges. Circle these two words: meaning and suffering. These are universal and timeless subjects to explore. Number three, this book has the rare combination of great personal human experience along with great training and expertise. This is a book written by a man who survived the death camps, barely, as everybody did, and it is a man who had psychiatric training. So he was a trained observer and a participant. It kind of reminds me, if any of you have ever dealt with the subject of depression. One of the great books on depression is called The Noonday Demon by Andrew Solomon. And he is a man who suffers from depression, and he is a renowned journalist. And so he wrote this book as a journalist who suffers from depression. Well, this is a Jewish man who survived the death camps and understood human nature as a psychiatrist. Okay, I'm going to read a number of quotes, but I want to begin with what I think are the two big ones. We're going to jump around a little. Turn to page 3 to quote number 22. And these are word for word out of the book.
Okay.
The truth.
Good luck. 4.
Is it different page number?
Yeah. 4.
Page 3 should be. I could be off. Page 4. Sorry. My apologies. All right, page 4, quote number 22. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. He wrote that contemplating his wife, who was not anywhere near him, and he did not know if she was still alive. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words. The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. So, love sustained him. His love of his beloved, who at that moment he did not know if she was alive or dead, and he never saw her again alive. Turn to number 29 on page 5. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing. And this is the quote of the book that is quoted through the years. The last of the human freedoms cannot be taken away: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now put 50 stars beside that quote. That's the quote of the book, and that's the quote that Viktor Frankl is most famous for. Number 30. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision. A decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. In the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision, and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, under any such circumstance, decide what shall become of him mentally and spiritually. And number 31, if there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. So, let me pause here and say that one of the reasons, dare I use the phrase, you really ought to read this book, is that it is pretty impossible to read this book and then use flippant language like, oh, we're suffering because the Cowboys haven't won a Super Bowl. That's not suffering. This past weekend, we had our grandson one night. He's 13 and a half months old. And I'm going to confess to you that by the time I finally fell into bed, I was a little sorry for myself. I was exhausted. And yet, that wasn't suffering. You read this book and you begin to ask, have you ever suffered? And the answer is some of us have. But you can't use the word flippantly and shallowly any longer after you read a book like this. It's a serious thing. Okay, we're going to do a lot more reading of quotes before I get to the other stuff. Turn now to back to page 2. And I think I'll be correct on the number 2. All right. Number 1. This is, by the way, from the foreword by Rabbi Harold Kushner, the version of the book with the foreword by Rabbi Kushner. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is one of the great books of our time. It is, first of all, a book about survival. That's worth circling because it really is a book about survival. But his account in this book is less about his travails, what he suffered and lost, than it is about the sources of his strength to survive. And Frankl, number 2, approvingly quotes the words of Nietzsche He who has a why to live for, can bear almost any how. But Frankl's concern is less with the question of why most die than it is with the question of why anyone at all survived. And at this point, I need to remind you of something. The percentage of people who survived the death camps was very small. But you have to understand that the percentage of survivors was intended to be zero. These were not work camps, these were death camps. And the Nazis had every intent to have nobody come out of those camps alive. And so, once you grasp that, as a person in the camps, the fact that any of them survived is miraculous beyond description. Okay, turn to page 3. This is from the preface to the 1992 edition, number 5. I do not at all see in the bestseller status of my book an achievement and accomplishment on my part, but rather an expression of the misery of our time. If hundreds of thousands of people reach out for a book whose very title promises to deal with the question of a meaning to life, it must be a question that burns under their fingernails. Number 6, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. So, and now we get to the original book. It was published in, I think, German. Is that right? Somebody help me, is that right? Published in another language, a European language. He wrote it in 9 days. And it was published in 1946, I think it was. Number 7. This tale is not concerned with the great horrors which have already been described often enough, though less often believed, but with the multitude of small torments. It will try to answer this question. How was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? When we get to the later part of my handout, I've got a list of realities of the camp that's just breathtaking. Number 8. Thus, it is not so much concerned with the sufferings of the mighty, but with the sacrifices, the crucifixion, and the deaths of the many, of the great army of unknown and unrecorded victims. I was talking to Gerald Britt a few minutes ago. In the Dallas Morning News 8 to 10 days ago, there was an article about lynchings in Denton in the 1920s. The article said the Ku Klux Klan was active in Denton, but the newspaper said the Ku Klux Klan is not active in North Texas. And then, in another page of the newspaper, it had ads for going to Klan gatherings. And there were 2 African Americans lynched in Denton around 1920, and here's how they reported it. 2 Negroes were lynched. End of discussion. No names, no perpetrators. 2 Negroes were lynched. It's the unknown and the unrecorded victims. The memorial in Montgomery by the Equal Justice Initiative of all of the lynching victims, and they're trying to recreate their names. Well, the people dying in the camps, unknown and unrecorded. Number 11. There was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only: to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home, and to save his friend With no hesitation, therefore, he would arrange for another prisoner, another number, to take his place in the transport. Here's the story. When prisoners were taken from Camp A to Camp B, they knew they were being taken to their death. And they did everything they could to make sure they stayed and somebody else got the seat. And so that's what that paragraph is about. Number 15, I'm going to read a bunch of these. 1 5-ounce piece of bread was our only food in 4 days. Nearly everyone in our transport lived under the illusion that he would be reprieved, that everything would yet be well, but in their heart of hearts they knew better. While we were waiting for the shower, our nakedness was brought home to us. We really had nothing now except our bare bodies, even minus hair. All we possessed literally was our naked existence. Somewhere it is said that man cannot exist without sleep for more than a stated number of hours. Quite wrong. I would like to mention a few similar surprises of how much we could endure. We were unable to clean our teeth, and yet in spite of that and a severe vitamin deficiency, we had healthier gums than ever before. Turn to page, whatever's next, page 4. Now, they would ask people to go to work. And if you didn't look up to it, you got killed. So, number 19, if you want to stay alive, there is only one way: look fit for work. If you even limp, because let us say you have a small blister on your heel, and an SS man spots this, he will wave you aside, and the next day you are sure to be gassed. Therefore, remember, shave, stand, and walk smartly. Then you need not be afraid of gas. So that's the reality they dealt with. All right? Number 24. Put a star beside 24. Humor was another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation. And so they relied on humor. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Number 25, we were grateful for the smallest of mercies. Turn the page. Number 32 is tough. You may remain brave, undignified, and unselfish. Or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. Here lies the chance for a man either to make use of or to forgo the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him. And this decides whether he is worthy of his sufferings or not. It is true that only a few people are capable of reaching such high moral standards. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and obtained those values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. When you read that passage, you might go back and think about the book by Elie Wiesel called Night. And there is a scene in Night, and boy is this from memory, I haven't read this in decades, but there's a scene from Night where a teenage boy kills his own father for a piece of bread. Imagine that. But what Frankl says is, you had some teenage boys who needed the bread who protected the other. So there were moments of transcendence. And so look at number 36. I quoted from Nietzsche, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger." Turn to page, whatever's next, 6. You now have a section in the book that introduces logotherapy, and I'm just going to read a couple of these quotes. Number 43, logotherapy focuses on the future. That is to say, on the meanings to be fulfilled by the patient in his future. It's a meaning-centered psychotherapy. Remember, he developed this before the camps. According to logotherapy, the striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. That's a whopping premise. Underline that. It's the primary motivational force in man, the search for meaning. Man's search for meaning. Number 47, it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension. The tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. And number 52, how does one find meaning? The first is by creating a work or by doing a deed. The second is by experiencing something or encountering someone. In other words, meaning can be found not only in work, but also in love. Okay, we're going to take 60 seconds, turn to the person next to you, and discuss one of the quotes we've read. Ready? Go. 60 seconds. Okay, let's begin to look back up here now. Let me be a little more assertive. Let's look back up here. Turn to page 7. Turn to page 7. I've already read the quote on the left. That we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. Man's search for meaning makes one clear and compelling point. People need meaning to keep living. And in a minute, you're going to see a couple of items from the experience that explains this. This search for meaning leads to a different meaning for each person. It's not everybody having the same meaning. But finding that meaning is essential for life itself. Okay. On the right, about Viktor Frankl, he was a doctor, neurologist, and psychiatrist, founded logotherapy, spent time in multiple different camps. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days, and it was German, published in 1946. English version came out in 1959. He first introduced the book to be published anonymously. He didn't give his name at first, when it was first published. He said, I was number 119,104, and most of the time I was digging and laying tracks for railway lines. That was his job in the camp. Digging and laying tracks for railway lines. Why is this a great book? This book has appeared in lists of the most influential books of the 20th century, frequently cited as a book having a profound and lasting influence on its readers. But here's what I think. If you read this book, everything else you're worrying about sort of fades. This is stuff that is the stuff of real struggle. What is this book? Well, number one, it's an account of his reflections and observations about the human struggle of the people he observed in his time in concentration camps. And yes, his own observation about his own experiences. Number two, from the 1992 preface. I therefore felt responsible for writing down what I had gone through, for I thought it might be helpful to people who are prone to despair. And though he does not say it, let's remember there are people who say there was no killing of millions of Jews, which is, I don't even know. And number three, this book is a concise description of the key elements of logotherapy. Now, note his manuscript, his life work, was taken from him. He had to recreate it. He had to, circle that phrase, he had to. That task kept him alive. He kind of wrote it in his head over and over. And finally, when he got out, he recreated it and wrote the other part of the story in 9 days. All right. I've tried to pull out the realities of the camp. And I've got a few items. Number one, the inmates were stripped of every human identifier. They lost their clothing, all of their possessions, their hair, their bodies were shaved entirely, and their names, they were given numbers and always called by their numbers. I'm going to tell you a story about Florence. In about 1974, I lived in Los Angeles, and I had a part in responding to people who had written into a Christian television program to go see about their needs. And I knocked on the door of Florence. And I ended up going back a number of times. This is in Los Angeles. She never left the house. Never. She was afraid of everybody. It took her many visits for her to trust me a little. And after a number of visits, she rolled up her sleeve and showed me the number. I'd never seen one. And I mean, I guess Florence was the one who said the ripple effects, long term, never go away. Never go away. Number two, there was inadequate nutrition, medicine, personal hygiene. Every human comfort was withheld from the inmates. And let me remind you, this is different than the fires sweeping down Malibu and you rush out of the house to get to a safe place grabbing one picture of it. I mean, these are people who had everything taken away because they were Jewish. That's the reason. Number three, the struggle was the struggle to keep going or to give up and face certain death. Number four, this book describes the surprising power and apparent deep human need for artistic expression. This was fascinating. He described how these frail bodies that were basically skeletons would push the beds off to the side and create a stage, and he said, quote, a cabaret was improvised from time to time. And there was a deep appreciation in the inmates of the beauty of nature, but they would put on little entertainments. The other night, my wife and I'm going to be honest, I said I can't watch another cable news show. And I heard an interview, and we went on Netflix and we watched Bathtubs Over Broadway. Whatever you're doing, watch Netflix, Bathtubs Over Broadway. It's a documentary done by a former David Letterman humor writer about industrial musicals. Tony Randall was in some. Tony Award-winning people were in them. It was an escape from cable news. And I thought of that when I reread this before I came to you. All right, number five, the book describes, put a circle beside number five, star this one. The book describes the signal of the cigarette. When an inmate would stay in the cabin and smoke a cigarette, they were used to trade with and all sorts of things. When he smoked it, that was the signal that he'd given up. He would soon die after that. So to smoke a cigarette was, I'm dying now. More important, the cigarettes could be exchanged for 12 soups, and 12 soups were often a very real respite from starvation. There was always, number 6, a mad scramble for anything salvageable or better from the body of the dead. When a person died, they all grabbed his shoes or any piece of clothing or finding anything he had squirreled away. Number 7, and just a word about the horror of the pointed finger. One at least had to look healthy enough to work, or the finger pointed to death. His right hand was lifted, and with the forefinger of that hand he pointed very leisurely to the right or the left. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movement of a man's finger pointing now to the right and now to the left, but more frequently, far more frequently, to the left. That was death. And a word about the spread of information within the camp. Somehow within the camp they learned, don't go to Malthusen. It was to be feared. And there was something in the news recently about somebody connected to Malthusen, and in the book Willful Blindness, there is a chilling account of the way they murdered the Jewish people in Malthusen. Inmates discussed food endlessly. Inmates discussed politics and discussed and practiced religion. Are people good or evil? Swine or saints? After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he's also that being who entered those gas chambers upright when the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. There were good guards and bad guards, but there was a resignation to circumstances. But yes, there were traces of humanity even among the worst moments. All right, put a box around this. The primary message of the book. Number 1, one must discover meaning to keep living. The will to meaning instead of the will to pleasure and instead of the will to power. Message 2, one has little control over what might happen, but the individual has the freedom to choose how he or she will respond to the situation. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. To choose one's own way. You got lots in there that remind you of Maslow, physiological need. You become an animal. What does this mean? Woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. A man who becomes conscious of the responsibility he bears toward a human being who affectionately waits for him or to an unfinished work will never be able to throw away his life. He knows the why for his existence, and now he can bear the how. So you strive to find and discern meaning in each moment of each day. And meaning is connected to doing. What will I do to live life with meaning? And so, he says we need a second statue. I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a statue of responsibility on the West Coast. And then, I don't have time to elaborate, but a warning about boredom, the modern existential vacuum, and the threats that come with addiction, alcoholism, suicide. He basically says when addiction rises, suicide rises because meaning is lost. Turn to page 9. 6 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, be prepared for suffering. It will come. Number 2, find your meaning and know your meaning in the tasks of your day every day. Number 3, cultivate an inner life so that it will be strong and ready when it is needed. Number 4, don't ever be surprised at the evil men do to one another. Number 5, cherish the small moments of humanity in the midst of the worst of any moment. And number 6, practice and cherish love and service. Man's Search for Meaning, I think the best book I've ever read. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.